When we touch the skull on the altar of the Grand Cathedral, we observe a scene that we're led to believe is the final interaction between Laurence and Willem. But what if I told you that this wasn't their last encounter, and that there's an untold chapter in their story that's been hiding in plain sight this entire time? What I'll present to you today, I believe, will completely upend everything we know about Laurence and his place in Bloodborne's story. It'll also solidify beyond a shadow of a doubt the medical metaphor that I've argued serves as a central framework for the game. I was fairly confident about how From Software landed on the name Laurence, and I summarized my thoughts on that matter in a previous episode of this series. But after further investigation, I can say with absolute certainty that I was wrong. Based on the information I'll share in this supplementary episode, I've come to the steadfast conclusion that it was a different real-life source who inspired Laurence's name. And as we'll see today, this same real-life source was the inspiration for Laurence's ultimate fate in the game. There's a body of evidence that indicates Laurence and Willem ended their relationship under much different circumstances than we thought. As with any deep lore dive, the process of uncovering this secret won't be quick or easy, but fortunately it won't be a slog. As we proceed through this episode, we'll make several game-changing discoveries that'll allow us to leave with a remarkable takeaway. Our journey today begins in an unlikely location and with an even unlikelier character. We commence with Dorez, the mysterious graveguard of the Forbidden Woods. Everything we learn about Dorez seems to come from the Graveguard attire set, which we're told belonged solely to this character. Unlike the hunter attire sets and other church garb that was worn by many, if not all, members of these professions or institutions, the Graveguard attire appears to have been worn specifically by Dorez. The text of this attire collection is unusual, telling us that two servants of Master Willem went mad after encountering the Eldritch Truth in the Labyrinth. The two servants, we're told, remained loyal to Willem even in madness. One became the gatekeeper, guarding the passageway to the Forbidden Woods with a password. The other, Dorez, became a graveguard of the forest, the Forbidden Woods. Dorez, a graveguard or gravekeeper, was assigned to this post, we can assume, not to tend to the thousands of graves littering the Forbidden Woods. Dorez, it seems, was there to prevent people from accessing the area appropriately named the Forbidden Grave, the final accessible site of the Forbidden Woods, which lies on the edge of the College of Byrgenwerth. Dorez was guarding this grave as a servant of Master Willem of Byrgenwerth. That's what the in-game lore would have us believe. So what exactly was going on in this graveyard adjacent to Byrgenwerth? Whatever it was, Willem didn't want people to know about it. It was forbidden activity that must be kept secret. This seems logical considering the unnamed gatekeeper in Cathedral Ward serves a very similar purpose to Dorez. He prohibits anyone from accessing the Forbidden Woods unless they know the secret password, the sacred adage of Byrgenwerth. I think it's fair to say that for most of us, that's the extent of our knowledge of these two characters, who seem to have little to no bearing on Bloodborne's larger story. But based on what I'll show you today, I think we've grossly misinterpreted Dorez, the gatekeeper, and their impact on the story of Willem and Laurence. First, though, we need to do a bit of scene setting. I promise you, this will be worth the effort. Let's recap what we've previously concluded about Byrgenwerth. As we've noted many times before, Byrgen is an Old English word meaning burial place or grave. Byrgenwerth, therefore, could be considered the College of the Grave, implying that the scholars of this college, this old place of learning, as Alfred calls it, were gaining knowledge by studying the contents of graves. That makes perfect sense considering they were delving into the tomb of the gods. As I noted in the final episode of my main series, the proximity of Byrgenwerth to the Forbidden Grave is a strong indication that the scholars of Byrgenwerth were digging through this graveyard to do their research. It seems reasonable to interpret that this is where they accessed the Tomb of the Gods and encountered this forbidden knowledge that drove Dorez and the Gatekeeper mad. As we've also discussed at length, Byrgenwerth's grave exploration is a key part of Bloodborne's overarching medical metaphor. It's a dramatic interpretation of real-life medical and surgical research of the 17 and 1800s that cuts through the entire game. In the Georgian and Victorian eras, the primary form of medical research was anatomical dissection. In the major cities of Great Britain, mainly London and Edinburgh, which were home to prestigious medical colleges and a number of private anatomy schools, there weren't enough dead bodies that could be legally obtained so that all of the young men training to be physicians and surgeons could perform dissections. To meet this demand for cadavers in these medical and surgical schools, anatomy instructors had to go to extreme lengths, which meant body snatching, digging up corpses from fresh graves. It was incredibly common for anatomy instructors to conscript their students or assistants into this grisly service as part of their enrollment in these sought-after medical programs. But surgeons would often keep a few men or even a gang of body snatchers on retainer who were known as resurrection men or sack-em-up men. The process of body snatching was fairly straightforward. After digging a shaft in the dirt, resurrection men would break open one end of the coffin, remove the body, stuff it into a bag, and take it under the cover of darkness to a grateful surgeon or anatomy instructor who would pay them handsomely for their ghoulish goods. This practice was routine for about 150 years. In earlier episodes, we've discussed how the uniform-clad students of the School of Mensis are portrayals of the anatomy students of the 1800s who would be draped in darkly colored gowns while performing dissections. Exceptionally important for our discussion today, there are two groups in Bloodborne that are responsible for obtaining bodies for the students of the School of Mensis. The first are the kidnapper enemies, who deliver freshly killed human subjects in a bag to the Hypogean jail. These figures are just like the body snatchers and burkers who delivered bodies in bags to anatomy schools. The others are the Yahar'gul hunters, who are described in their attire set as kidnappers who wear this attire to, quote, blend into the night. These kidnapper figures who blend into the night are just like the real-life body snatchers who dug up graves under the cover of night and delivered the corpses in cloth or burlap bags to surgeons at anatomy schools, just like the School of Mensis or the College of Byrgenwerth. The Yahar'gul hunters are described as, quote, hunters in name only, who answered to the village's founders, the School of Mensis. Just like the hired goons who dug up bodies for early surgeons and anatomists, the Yahar'gul hunters work on behalf of these scholarly figures of Mensis. It's a one-to-one parallel. It's crucial to recap these findings, because the Graveguard set employs some of the same elements while taking us a couple of steps further. We can reveal these details with a close inspection of the attire artwork, followed by a reading of the item descriptions. Let's start with the visual attributes first. Understandably, the most striking feature of Dorez's design is his mask, but this is the spooky, shiny object to distract us from the information-rich details everywhere else in his attire. Let's focus instead on the Graveguard robe. Here, we can spot an accessory shared with the Yahar'gul hunters, a length of rope wrapped around the torso and hanging off the side at the waist. There's a reason why both Dorez and the Yahar'gul hunters have this on their clothing. Rope was essential in the body-snatching business. You'd need it in some cases to pull up a coffin that had been buried more than just a few feet underground. But body snatchers commonly would loop a rope around the body to drag it out of the coffin, just like the rope we see looped around the torso of these two attire sets. This is the first of several pieces of information that link Dorez to body snatching and anatomical dissection. I realize that might seem like a stretch right now, but as we continue, you'll realize it's not a stretch in the slightest. The artwork for the Graveguard mask and robe give us yet another valuable piece of information that's incredibly easy to overlook. These attire pieces, as we can see here, aren't made of cloth. They're made of burlap, just like the bags that Bloodborne's kidnapper enemies use to bring our body to Yahar'gul. More importantly, it's just like the bags that the real-life resurrection men would have used to transport bodies to anatomists. Let's return to the Graveguard mask for a minute. In addition to the ghostly face, the unusual shape of this mask gives it an occult, ritualistic aesthetic. But the pointy edges that poke out on the sides of the Graveguard mask have always seemed strange to me. Then I realized why they look like this. The Graveguard mask is a burlap sack. The pointy edge that we see on our left is the bottom corner of the bag. The stitching in the middle of the mask is just like you'd use to sew up the sides of the burlap sack. Suddenly, the ghostly face of the Graveguard mask makes much more sense. With rope tied around the body and a burlap sack thrown over its head, Dorez is supposed to look like a dead body being pulled from a grave. So, with a quick inspection, we've already discovered 2 game-changing details about Dorez, but we're just getting started. The item description for the Graveguard kilt and the Graveguard manchettes contains a sentence that the other items in the attire set don't have. These articles of clothing are, quote, covered in the blood of untidy rituals. If you recall from the final episode of my Agony of Effort series, I put forth a good bit of evidence that Bloodborne's rituals are code for anatomical dissection. It's one of the main takeaways of the series, and one that I knew would be hard for many players to accept. I won't regurgitate the entire segment from that episode, but I noted that many of the ritual materials of Bloodborne are labeled in their item descriptions as body parts. More importantly, several of these ritual materials are body parts displayed in glass containers filled with fluid, just like the diseased tissues and internal organs that real-life anatomists of the 1700s and 1800s would have removed from cadavers during dissection and then preserved in jars filled with alcohol solutions. The Graveguard kilt and manchettes are telling us that the game's rituals are bloody and untidy, much like the process of dissecting a corpse would be. But the Graveguard robe is the linchpin of this metaphor. Its description states, "Countless bloodied ritual tools hang from its back," meaning the back of the robe. Even not knowing what these tools are, this description tells us that these rituals aren't just bloody ordeals. They require certain tools for the job. When we look at the attire artwork again, we're able to see these ritual tools that are referenced in the robe's description. The largest and most recognizable ritual tool on the back of the Graveguard robe is a bone saw. These were commonly used in amputations, as we discussed in Bite-Sized Bloodborne number 3, but they were a traditional tool in the dissection kits of the 1700s and 1800s. The other instruments here are a little harder to identify, so let's go left to right. First, we have a metal tool that looks incredibly similar to bone forceps found in US Civil War medical kits of the mid-1800s. Bone forceps also would have been used in dissections of the 1800s and are still in use for dissections today. Next, we have a retractor, perhaps what's known as a Deaver retractor. This would be used to pull back the openings of a large, deep incision in the chest or abdomen. The pair of hooked instruments to the right are also antique retractors used in surgery and dissection. And lastly, we have what appears to be either a probe or a pinfield dissector tool. The ritual tools of the Graveguard are tools that real-life anatomists would have used to dissect bodies in the 1700s and 1800s. You might be wondering, what about the big hook and the hand axe that we see here? Are those dissection tools? No, they're not. But in terms of the hook, I think it's like the burlap bag and the rope on the torso of the Graveguard robe. It's a tool for body snatching. An 1896 article in the leading British medical journal The Lancet describes the use of large hooks in the body snatching business. After resurrection men dug a shaft, quote, "The coffin was lugged up by hooks to the surface, or, preferably, the end of the coffin was wrenched off with hooks while still in the shelter of the tunnel." As for the hand axe, I'm not sure. Axes really weren't used in surgery or dissection because they were inaccurate and didn't produce the clean cuts of saws or incision knives. Axes also weren't used to open coffins in the act of body snatching. As medical researcher Frederick Waite noted in a historical review of body snatching in the 1800s, use of an axe or hatchet made too much noise for safety. A hook, crowbar, or auger would have been the tool of choice because it would allow body snatchers to break open the coffin much more quietly and not arouse suspicion. Continuing our examination of the Graveguard attire, On the front side of the robe, we find a satchel containing what might be another bone saw and the handles of large forceps. We don't get a full view of these tools, so it's hard to say precisely what they are. But the concept art for the Graveguard attire shows a bone saw and what might be 2 blades of surgical scissors that have been separated. To summarize what we've revealed so far, we've seen that the Graveguard Dorez went into the Tomb of the Gods alongside the man who would become the Gatekeeper of Byrgenwerth. Dorez's attire is equipped with tools for bloody, untidy rituals, and the instruments that were used in these rituals were the tools that body snatchers would have used to obtain corpses, and that anatomists would have used to dissect them. If we're supposed to apply these details to Bloodborne's narrative, then seemingly every bit of information we can obtain about Dorez indicates that he was a body snatcher who engaged in, or assisted with, anatomical dissection. This is critical. Dissection is a popular theme in Bloodborne, and especially for the figures of the Forbidden Woods, which include the Medaris twins. As we can observe, if we summon him or if we kill Volter, the younger Medaris twin is dressed in the Butcher attire set. We learn from its attire description that, somewhat like Dorez, the Medaris twins were denizens of the Forbidden Woods. And just like Dorez's Graveguard attire, the Butcher set worn by the Medaris twins contains a bevy of references to anatomical dissection, both in its artwork and in its text. As I pointed out in Part 5 of my Agony of Effort series, the item descriptions for the Butcher attire tell us that the twins dissected their beast prey to support the villagers in their forbidden research. Obviously, we see the word dissected in the English and Japanese text, but beyond that, the visuals of the set are indicative of dissection. The Butcher garb contains a sullied apron, much like those worn by early anatomists, while the Butcher mask is modeled upon a medieval executioner's hood. The younger Medaris twin also carries the Hunter's Axe, which is wielded, according to its item description, by those who wish to play the part of the executioner. This isn't a coincidence. In Great Britain, the bodies of executed criminals were the primary source of cadavers that anatomists were allowed to dissect in the mid to late 18th century, following the implementation of the Murder Act of 1752. The prey, if you will, of real-life executioners were convicted criminals who would be hanged and then dissected for medical research. The forbidden research of the Forbidden Woods seems to be a reference to anatomical dissection, which also might shade how we interpret the Forbidden Grave. As a final point on the Butcher attire, Last Protagonist notes in his Japanese retranslations that the name for this attire in its original Japanese isn't the Butcher set, it's the Dissection set. He even notes that the Japanese word in the title of this attire set, quote, literally means to separate viscera and is more commonly taken as autopsy or dissect. There's a common theme here in the Forbidden Woods, as we can see. Thus far, Dorez fits perfectly into Bloodborne's central medical metaphor, which primarily focuses on body snatching and anatomical dissection. But there's one more thing I think we have to consider. And if you'll forgive the grandiosity of the statement, I think it's a revolutionary idea that upends our long-held notions of the game's plot, while solidifying my argument for Bloodborne's hidden meaning. When we speak with Alfred in Cathedral Ward, he gives us a brief history of the College of Byrgenwerth. As we've discussed, Byrgenwerth can only be accessed through the Forbidden Woods, and is immediately adjacent to the Forbidden Grave. Alfred tells us, once a group of young Byrgenwerth scholars discovered a holy medium deep within the tomb, referring to the Tomb of the Gods, or the Labyrinth. Alfred goes on to say that the discovery of this holy medium, quote, led to the founding of the Healing Church and the establishment of blood healing. Within the lore community, the term holy medium has often been interpreted as a substance, such as the old blood, a great one, or some other remnant of the great ones. It's also often assumed that these young Byrgenwerth scholars that Alfred mentions included Laurence and possibly even Gehrman and Maria. But there's no information in the game that directly or even really indirectly links these named characters to this group from Byrgenwerth that went into the tomb. Additionally, there's no direct evidence that the holy medium they found was the old blood or something related to the Great Ones. So who exactly were these young Byrgenwerth scholars, and what exactly was this holy medium that they discovered? I think we have the answers to these two questions. Let's focus first on what the scholars discovered. For that question, we need to turn to the Japanese text. Arukimanya has released dozens of videos over the last 5 years examining the game's original Japanese and comparing it with Bloodborne's official English text. I've previously cited his work from his Translation-Born series. In one of his videos from 2017, which I've linked in the description, he points out that while the English version uses the term holy medium to describe whatever it was that the Byrgenwerth scholars discovered in, and retrieved from, the Tomb of the Gods, the original Japanese uses the term seitai, which can be interpreted in a couple of ways. The most common translation for seitai is Eucharist, meaning the bread and wine that Christians consume during communion. This translation certainly gives a divine or godly aura to whatever was found in the Tomb of the Gods, and that's important, as we'll find out. But seitai can also mean simply holy body, which can be interpreted in a much more literal sense. The term is used to describe the physical body of Christ, or the bodies of emperors, who in Japan are believed to be of a divine bloodline. This opens up the possibility that Byrgenwerth scholars didn't just bring back some divine substance, they delved into the tomb and brought back a dead body. Alfred also tells us that this holy medium, or holy body, is venerated in the main cathedral. As we know, the thing that's venerated in the main cathedral is the beastly skull of Laurence. This is why Last Protagonist has suggested that the holy medium was the body or skull of Laurence. That obviously sounds strange and runs counter to the popular sentiment in the lore community. But it's hard to argue with the text-based evidence. And after what I'm about to show you, I'm confident you'll agree that this is the correct interpretation. Laurence, as we know, underwent some sort of beastly transformation and became the first cleric beast. Because Laurence was somehow associated with the establishment of blood healing, a practice that ends up transforming a large number of humans into beasts, there are certainly many correlations with Robert Louis Stevenson's story Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as I've previously discussed. I had assumed that this was the main inspiration for Laurence, and that his name was also derived from sources associated with the anesthesia-like healing blood that became Laurence's long-term legacy. While I don't reject my earlier conclusions about the influential role of Jekyll and Hyde on Bloodborne's beastly transformation and the healing blood, I now know that my conclusions about Laurence's naming origins were completely and utterly wrong. Please allow me to correct the record with this bit of history. In the late 1750s, an Irish-born clergyman suffering from pulmonary tuberculosis and a troubled marriage found a new calling. From his home in Sutton-on-the-Forest, a tiny village near York in the far north of England, he wrote and self-published a series of comic novels that almost overnight made him a celebrity in London and a star in the literary circles of England and France. The novels, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, were of a satirical styling that was both endearing and somewhat controversial at the time. But at least for our purposes, it isn't so much the literary works of this man that connect him to Bloodborne. Instead, it's the details of his life and, more importantly, his death. Laurence Sterne became vicar of Sutton-on-the-Forest in the late 1730s and performed vicary duties for nearby Stillington as well. It was after 20 years in the clergy and only after advancing into his mid-40s that Sterne tried his hand at writing, becoming an almost instant success. Unfortunately for Laurence Sterne and his readers, his tuberculosis worsened rapidly in 1768, shortly after Sterne published what would be his final work, A Sentimental Journey. He died in March of that year, and despite his modest fame, was buried in a pauper's graveyard in Hanover Square in London. That's when matters turned to the macabre. 2 days after Sterne's burial, body snatchers dug up his corpse, transported it almost 60 miles north, and sold it to anatomists at the Medical College at Cambridge. There, Sterne's remains were dissected by Professor of Anatomy Charles Collignon. Although there are differing accounts of the events that day, someone in the audience recognized that the body on the dissecting table was that of known author Laurence Sterne. It wasn't enough to stop the dissection and the accompanying lecture, but it certainly changed the destination of Sterne's remains after the procedure was completed. Typically, dissected bodies, or the miscellaneous pieces of it, would be buried unceremoniously near anatomy schools, prisons, or workhouses, or they could just be cremated. But that's not what happened with Sterne's remains. According to biological archaeologists Jenna Dittmar and Piers Mitchell, it's believed that a student or a faculty member retrieved Sterne's remains after the dissection and returned them to London for burial. Believe it or not, we haven't reached the strangest part of this story. I think the amateur historians from the blog The London Dead captured it best in their entry on the strange saga of Laurence Sterne. Following the dissection, quote, Sterne's corpse was discreetly returned to St. George's Field, sans head, according to some who reckoned that Dr. John Parsons or Dr. Collignon hung on to the skull as a souvenir. It's believed that Charles Collignon, the anatomy professor who performed the dissection, wanted Sterne's skull as a part of an anatomy collection that he would go on to amass over the years. It was the first collection of its kind at Cambridge, and many of its preparations remain at the Medical College today as part of the Duckworth collection. More than 250 years after the dissection of Laurence Sterne, no one can say for certain whether his skull is one of the hundreds at Cambridge, as many researchers insist, or whether it indeed was returned to St. George's Field in London all those years ago. Many of the graves at the old cemetery were relocated in the 1960s to make way for commercial development. The Laurence Sterne Trust and its curator, Kenneth Monkman, hoped to help facilitate the transfer and reinterment of Sterne's remains, and they received permission to search for his remains at the grave marked by his headstone. To their bewilderment, they found several skulls in and around the grave, including one whose cranium had been sawn completely off, a telltale sign of dissection. In short, Laurence Sterne died and his body was removed from its grave and dissected. His head was removed, and it's possible that its cranium was sawn completely off. And more than 2 centuries later, no one really has a clue what happened to the missing skull of Vicar Laurence. The similarities between the 18th century author, Laurence Sterne, and the former scholar of Bergenworth, Laurence, are hard to ignore. They share the same name with the same spelling. They share the same vicar title. Their heads were somehow removed after death so they could be kept on display. And there's a strong implication in the item, Laurence's skull, that his skull is lost and can't be found. These similarities also strongly indicate to us that just like the body of Laurence Sterne, the body of Laurence, the first vicar, might have also been removed from the grave and dissected. This is what Alfred was telling us. This holy medium, or holy body that was found in the tomb of the gods and brought back, was the body of Laurence. This body, or at least what remains of it, is what is venerated in the Grand Cathedral. Laurence, according to what Alfred is telling us, is the origin of the healing blood. It wasn't Queen Yarnum, it wasn't Abritus, it was Laurence. The body of Laurence being this holy entity also makes the other translation of Setai seem completely appropriate. As we discussed earlier, Setai is most commonly translated as Eucharist, the bread and wine symbolizing the body and blood of Christ that are consumed in the religious ceremony of communion. By consuming this symbol of dead but divine flesh and blood, Christians make spiritual contact with Christ. Compare that with Laurence, whose bodily remains are found in a religious sanctuary, the Grand Cathedral. He's considered a messianic figure within the Healing Church, a quasi-religious organization led by clerics and nuns. Body snatchers were called resurrection men because they brought bodies out of the grave, just like in Christian theology, Jesus rose from the dead and disappeared from his tomb. Laurence being resurrected, so to speak, is yet another Christ-like quality that From Software seems to be leaning into by playing on the literal and lingual symbols of body snatching. Whereas Christ resurrected, Laurence was resurrected. We've answered the question, what was the holy medium or holy body that this group of Byrgenwerth scholars discovered in the Tomb of the Gods? It was Laurence. But we still haven't answered the question, who were the Byrgenwerth scholars that made this discovery? I don't think we can answer this question with absolute certainty, but I think we could come very close. If Laurence was the holy medium that was found in the tomb, then clearly Laurence wasn't part of this group of scholars that made this discovery. So who were they? I think it might have been Doras and the Gatekeeper. That might sound ludicrous at first, but let me show you several things and have you look at some well-known features in the game with a completely different perspective. I'd ask you to hold your judgment until then. We know for certain that Master Willem, the head scholar at Byrgenwerth, sent or even accompanied a small group of his servants into the labyrinth. The Japanese text leaves open the possibility that he led this group into the tomb. These servants were Doras and the man who would become the Gatekeeper. As we've already shown in great detail, everything about Doras is associated with body snatching and dissection. It therefore seems a very safe bet that Willem sending or accompanying Doras into a tomb was for a very specific purpose, to snatch a body for dissection. This tandem of Doras and the future Gatekeeper could have been merely servants, much like the hired body snatchers that surgeons or anatomy instructors of the 18th and 19th centuries often relied upon. But as I mentioned before, it wasn't at all uncommon for medical colleges and anatomy schools to push the burden of obtaining bodies onto the medical students. A fictional but still accurate depiction of this very thing is the plot of R.L. Stevenson's short story, The Body Snatcher. Two of the senior medical students in this 1884 story are tasked with obtaining bodies at the insistence of their headmaster, who is referred to only as Mr. K. The work takes them by night to remote graveyards in the countryside near Edinburgh, where they dig up what they believe is a farmer's wife and start to bring it back to the medical school in their horse-drawn carriage. Although they're called servants in the graveguard attire, could Doras and the Gatekeeper have been scholars of Byrgenwerth following the orders of their headmaster? Removing Laurence's body from the tomb is one thing. Dissecting it is another. How do we know that Laurence's body was dissected? Because the game tells us so. The surgery altar in The Hunter's Nightmare, as I said in part 14 of my Agony of Effort series, is a monument to the art of dissection. That's not hard to figure out. But there's a very important detail that takes on a new and exceptional significance after what we've discovered about the real-life influence for Laurence. The dissected corpse on the table is missing the top of its skull. I previously thought that the surgery altar was just a scene or symbol to underscore the importance of anatomical dissection to Bloodborne's story and underlying metaphor. But after further review, I don't think that's true. I think this sculpture captures a moment in time in the Bloodborne story. It depicts the dissection of the body of Laurence. As we noted about the corpse of Laurence Sterne, his head was removed in a dissection, and quite possibly the top of the cranium was sawn off. This is identical to the body on the table of the surgery altar. In order to activate the elevator for the surgery altar, we have to obtain an item called the eye pendant, which we find resting in the hand of Laurence, the first vicar, in his cleric beast form in the other Nightmare Cathedral. We have to bring it back and place it in the skull of a dissected body on the surgery altar. This directly links Laurence, in his cleric beast form, to the dissected body on the table. When we use the elevator device, the platform directly below the surgery altar shows the waking world altar of the Grand Cathedral, upon which Laurence's beastly skull resides. We're supposed to associate Laurence's skull with his dissection. It's crucial to note that the device used to activate the elevator is the eye pendant. Its description tells us that we need to grant eyes to the surgery altar skull. This is the same phrase that Micolash uses in his famous line, "Grant us eyes, plant eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy." By putting eyes on this corpse's brain, by granting it eyes, we're putting an eye into the cavity of a dissected body. This is exactly what I meant when I said earlier in this series that the term eyes on the inside means a surgeon's or anatomist's ability to literally see inside the human body during a surgical operation or dissection. But that's not all. There's another major piece of this puzzle I think we've completely misinterpreted. Once we obtain the item Lawrence's skull from the lower level of the surgery altar, we can return to the Nightmare Cathedral and use it to revive Laurence. When we do, he returns to life, and we see him close the hand that was previously holding the eye pendant, as if he recognizes that it's been removed. It was. We placed it in the skull of the dissected body on the surgery altar. He then places his other hand not on his eyes, but on the top of his head. This is the moment that Laurence realizes that his head was removed, or dissected. He's now aware that hunters took his remains from his grave and dissected them. He's not overcome with guilt from his own actions. He's outraged at what others did to his body. Much like I had assumed the surgery altar was just a signal to emphasize the concept of dissection, I thought the same thing about the unique posture of Lawrence's burning cleric beast body in the Nightmare Cathedral. Here again, I was wrong. As I've pointed out many times, Lawrence's corpse is positioned to look exactly like From Nature, a plaster cast of a dissected body by Scottish surgeon and anatomist John Goodsir made in 1845. This isn't an accident. It's a deliberate design choice to scream to us that Laurence was dissected. It also has the side benefit of conveying the symbol of Christ from Michelangelo's Pieta, which was also the inspiration to Goodsir's From Nature. That's not all that the surgery altar shows us. There are three figures surrounding the body. As many have long assumed, the figure leading this dissection ritual appears to be a young Master Willem, who's wearing a distinctive hat similar to the one we see him wearing on the balcony overlooking the Moonside Lake. He's accompanied by two assistants. Not one, not three, two. The same number of servants he sent into the labyrinth. Maybe this is Doris and the gatekeeper. There's not enough information to make that conclusion with complete confidence, but there are a few things worth noting. We know from the Graveguard attire descriptions that these two characters went mad after going into the Tomb of the Gods and coming into contact with the Eldritch Truth, which means some sort of arcane knowledge. The concept of madness is almost omnipresent in Bloodborne, but there's something that connects madness almost across the board. Madness is the result of people coming into contact with the arcane, meaning the unknown internal features of the human body. People who come into contact with dead bodies in the tombs or engage in dissection rituals afterward lose their minds. For just a few examples, the ritual of Mensis, which I've argued is a reference to anatomical dissection, is performed by, quote, madmen who toil surreptitiously. The player character gains arcane knowledge by consuming the contents of a dead man's skull, receiving madman's knowledge. The madman's attire set is worn by healing church tomb prospectors who, quote, can't withstand the weight of the old knowledge. Those who, quote, delve into the arcane fall all too easily into madness, so they must take sedative, a liquid medicine developed at Bergenworth. Lastly, the bell-ringing woman appears to be a mad Thumerian, having come into contact with the cosmos. These women ring their bells and bring enemies back to life. They resurrect the dead. One of the figures in the surgery altar is holding a bell over the corpse of Laurence. Like the mad bell-ringing women, these chime maidens, they're figuratively resurrecting Laurence, to use the parlance of 18th century body snatchers, or resurrection men. I anticipate many people will find it hard to accept this idea that the body on the table of the surgery altar is that of Laurence. How could this be Laurence when we know that his skull looked like this? To that, I would say, The game already gives us 3 versions of what Laurence's skull or body could be. We have his beastly skull in the waking world. We have his cleric beast form, which, as we well know, doesn't seem to accurately reflect the nature of his beastly transformation in the waking world. And finally, we have the item Laurence's skull, which shows a fairly standard human skull many years after death. In a sense, it's almost like Miyazaki is playing upon the mystery of the skull of Laurence Sterne. In the case of Sterne, there are 3 possible outcomes. Sterne's skull might have been returned to a grave in London almost entirely intact. Alternatively, it might have been reinterred with the top of the cranium sawn off. And finally, it might still be residing in a collection at Cambridge. The ambiguity of Laurence's skull in the game matches the uncertainty of the fate of Laurence Sterne's skull in real life. If you're still not sold on this idea, let's look at one final thing. Bloodborne's opening cinematic shows the hunter hacking his way through the beasts of Yharnam before abruptly changing the setting. We see the hunter emerge in a dark location carrying a torch. This place is abandoned. The candles are extinguished. There's no one here. But at last we see a familiar sight, followed by the skull of Laurence. I had always assumed this cinematic was showing us the Grand Cathedral, but I don't think that's true. The hunter's walking through narrow corridors that don't exist in the Grand Cathedral. I think this cinematic is showing us Laurence's tomb. This is the labyrinth. This is where the scholars of Byrgenwerth discovered the holy body of Laurence and brought his remains to the surface. This is the holy medium. The cathedral containing the surgery altar appears to tell the story of Laurence in 3 acts. At the entrance to the cathedral, there's a monument to Laurence, showing what is likely his recently deceased human body wrapped in a bag or perhaps a death shroud, having been removed from the grave. From there, it was taken elsewhere for further investigation, to be dissected, as we see on the surgery altar. Presumably, years later, Laurence's skull, removed long ago, becomes the holy medium upon which the healing church was founded, as we see on the lower level of the surgery altar. Laurence's story has been in front of our eyes the whole time, and it's far more detailed and unexpected than we could have imagined. We just needed the medical metaphor to see it. Thanks for watching.